If you're looking for a forum of people that are all interested pretty much in the exact same thing, the creation of electronic music and tech gear, check out my Discord. It's an open server. Everyone is invited. Good vibes only though. And if you'd like to show some extra support, check out my Patreon. There's a bunch of exclusive content over there, like the extended version of this video of me deciding to get rid of a ton of gear, or maybe this extended video exploring the Nord Drum 3P in combination with the Oxy 1, so sequencing it in that unique sort of way. Purchasing gear is one thing, purchasing too much gear is another thing. Purchasing too much gear as a result of watching too many YouTube videos, well, that's just the worst of it, right? As you may already know, YouTube is kind of a double-edged sword. It's one of the best resources for free knowledge. It's also really consuming, and it has a tendency to push your interests at you in this sort of marketable way. A few of you have mentioned in past gas-related videos that you thought my approach helped you not buy that instrument that you don't necessarily need, or maybe even likely that you don't need, or to at least guide you in the right direction into investing in something that's actually beneficial to you, depending on, you know, where you're coming from musically or from an engineering background, whatever it might be. And so I wanted to continue into this helpful direction with this video, perhaps like a gas remedy type of video. And of course, I'm happy to help. Thanks for being here. I'll start by saying that, of course, there's nothing wrong with owning lots of gear. Like, it's clearly not hurting anybody and you could do what you want with your own money. But if you clicked on this video, you probably have at least a tendency into keeping up with all the latest and greatest, the bestest gear around, with the intention, whether subconscious or not, to purchase that gear. I've said it a bunch and I'll say it again, this is almost like becoming a theme of this channel. It's when you're purchasing all kinds of overlapping gear. So like, for example, if you own 5 groove boxes and you're looking for the next best groove box, or maybe like multiple samplers that are very similar. Like, you get what I'm saying. In my opinion, that's when it becomes a problem. At the same time, this is coming from the perspective of someone who purchases gear in order to create music with that gear and, you know, create products, release music. For myself and pretty much anyone who creates electronic music with gear, obviously you have to have some sort of command and understanding of the gear that you're using. Someone who with a bit more of an artistic background, that's not really where it ends. I want to use said piece of gear as an instrument. I've been to Superbooth. I have an awareness of, I guess we'll call it the spectrum. So on this side is full-blown engineer, interested in creating instruments, maybe taking apart instruments and understanding how they work. And then on this side of the spectrum is full-on artist, which I think in electronic music doesn't really exist. You have to be somewhere in the middle. You have to have some sort of interest in the technical aspect of how everything connects. I understand through reading the comments of this channel that, again, some people just like to purchase a piece of gear, take it apart, put it back together again. In which case, I guess my point about overlapping gear doesn't really, it's kind of obsolete for those types of minds. But anyway, we'll put that to the side. That's a whole other perspective. I can only give you my perspective. Gear versus instruments. To me, I'm beginning to see more and more like gear is gear until it turns into an instrument. So when does it become an instrument? In my opinion, when you develop the reflexes to use that piece of gear as an instrument. A mixer is an instrument if you know how to use it as an instrument. And so is the SP404 Mark II, and so is the analog rhythm, etc. To me, the word gear makes me think technical. It's kind of like a shallow term. It makes me think of maybe walking into someone's studio, someone who has a shit ton of gear, and just being impressed by all the buttons, like, wow, look at all this gear. Especially with someone who keeps up to date with new gear, there's always like a sense of wonder, like, what can that gear do? What have they improved on it? How will this help me improve my own music creation with said piece of gear? To me, this is all positive. But then there's the word instrument, which like traditionally makes me think of, I don't know, like an acoustic guitar or a drum set. We're in a time now where electronic music has become just as popular, if not much more popular, than music that was created with traditional instruments. So if you make music with a groove box, why not start calling a groove box an instrument as opposed to a piece of gear? Why not call a mixer an instrument? Because that's what it is. I'll give you like an elite but relevant example. So someone like Jeff Mills, who uses the TR-909, he uses it as an instrument. He really does. If you haven't seen that full video, I highly suggest that you check it out. That is like a masterpiece. It's clear that this is how Jeff Mills approaches the TR-909. As an instrument, he knows it like the back of his hand. He has amazing reflexes using it. Over the course of a few decades, he's got like his go-to instruments that he's renowned for using. So things like the TR-909, which he uses in combination with his DJ, setup. He chose his select few instruments and just decided to dig deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into them. So that's just one example. That's his approach. The point I'm trying to make here is that in the YouTube community, there's like a pretty big disconnect for people who are looking to use gear or instruments in any sort of creative way, so like to create music. You definitely don't need all the new gear to create electronic music or to perform live electronic music. Truly, in the end, all you really need is a few instruments, and it might be like a rotation of a few instruments, but don't lose focus. Don't let all of these new gear releases take your focus off the gear that maybe you're trying to master, that you already vibe with. The big question though is like, how do you stumble upon or how do you find the type of gear that's gonna work for you? And that's something we're gonna touch on later in this video. So that is step one of how to wrap your head around this whole concept. As we all know, no piece of gear is perfect. They all have their limitations. And these limitations, especially depending on how limited you end up being, this is what leads us to want to purchase the next best piece of gear. I think that's actually a rational way of thinking. Ultimately, in my little experience doing the live thing, I've learned that there's never going to be anything that's perfect. There's going to be limits no matter what piece of gear you're going to be using. That's just the reality. Let's zoom out for a second and say that you have a bigger setup. In electronic music, this is where the term macro instrument comes into play, which I think also influences how much money you're actually going to be spending on gear and what is a rational versus irrational buy in the context of this video. If you're someone who does or someone who is striving to have a bigger setup to either play around with or perform live electronic music, the more time you spend with that setup, the more you're really going to start looking at it as like a well-oiled machine, and the more you're going to be looking at your entire setup as one instrument. To go back to my buddy Pat's improv techno setup, here is that video if you'd like to see his approach. He has an absolutely insane approach. So he's got several units in the setup, like the analog rhythm, the PC-12, 1010 black box, the mod dwarf, and each of these pieces was selected by Pat for a very specific role within his setup, with the goal of creating a macro instrument to create live electronic music with. Live techno, improv techno music with, actually. The analog rhythm provides the sonics, the PC-12 provides the hands-on tactility, non-menu divey control of everything that's going on within the analog rhythm. The analog rhythm alone is an extremely powerful unit, but it doesn't give you this sort of like blown up hands-on control that the PC-12 pulls out of the analog rhythm. So clearly it was just a really rational and fun addition to the setup, like a very precise addition. The mod dwarf is like an end of audio chain mastering unit before going into speakers, which obviously the analog rhythm and PC-12 don't really provide. If Pat wants to drop some samples into his set, he's also got the black box there where he can very easily pull that off. This gives access to a whole new palette of longer samples, perhaps, maybe some vocal samples or sounds that the analog rhythm doesn't really have as much control over. Or if, let's say, all 12 voices on the analog rhythm are being used. So all the options are there, and there's virtually no overlap from one unit to the next within this setup. It's very efficient. What I think the problem is, I'm going to be harping on this one again, just because I think that it's a relevant issue that keeps popping up within this community. It's that idea of overlap. Again, when you have several units that basically do the same thing, and maybe even at that point, you're like looking for the next best sampler. This is when I think you'd be running into what I would call irrational spending. And no, it doesn't help that with every release, there's like 5 or 10 creators plus the company that's releasing that piece of gear, like trying to shove it down your throat, maybe tempting you to buy it right away. If you're an engineer or maybe even a content creator like myself who's more in the educational realm, showing how each of these new pieces of gear works, then yeah, it makes sense to have all the different pieces of gear, all the overlapping pieces of gear. Mind you, these days I'm making a strong effort to bring my channel into a different direction and not rely on new gear. Regardless of those tips, the reality is that it still never really ends, does it? Especially if you're interested in new gear. I know I'm contradicting myself. And so what exactly do I mean there? Why is that? Well, that's the next topic we're gonna be getting into after today's sponsor, DistroKid. If you're watching this video, there's a good chance that you're creating electronic music that potentially you'd like to release to the public. You might even want to officially release it to all major streaming platforms independently? Well, in that case, DistroKid is definitely the best choice for you. Let's get into some reasons why it's great. In terms of what's new, they recently released a smartphone app, which makes checking your important DistroKid stats easy and accessible. The app is now available on Android through the Play Store. Essentially everything that you've been able to do on the DistroKid desktop app, you're now able to do through your smartphone. In fact, here's a list of key features that the app offers you. You might want to pause it now if you want to check them out. In today's day and age, we all know how many hats we have to wear as artists and producers. It can just be a lot, so write the music, produce the music. Then you've got to create content to promote it a few weeks before it's released. Then you've got to continue creating content after it's been released to promote it. It's a lot, and I'm not saying that DistroKid does all of this work for you, but they do make it a lot easier for us with the free promotional tools that they offer. The one I use most is Hyperfollow. It's essentially a free landing page or link tree. It's super clean. You could link maybe your latest video, your latest single, other important links you'd like to lead people to. I also use promo cards whenever I release a single. Just select the single that you would like to promote and it'll auto-generate a few different options for you to choose from. Go with DistroKid. It's just over $20 a year to release unlimited music to all major streaming platforms. You keep 100% of your streaming royalties. So many other tools that they offer for someone who's independent, they're made for us. And there is a discount linked in the description of this video if you would like to join. The reality is that the spending still never really ends. Again, this is contradictory to everything else that I've mentioned in this video, but there is a certain reality to this whole situation that, I mean, let's be real about it. As I mentioned before, because of the limitations of your setup, there's always going to be something that you might want to improve with that setup. And there is no shortage of new gear now. Or maybe not even new gear, maybe just better gear that could do the thing that you want it to do better than in your current setup. And I think the most important thing in this part of the video is boredom. There's the notion of getting bored with the setup, which is something we haven't really touched on yet. If you're exploring or performing with the same piece of gear within your setup and you're using it over and over and over again, yes, you're getting a lot better with that piece of gear. You're starting to understand it. You're developing reflexes. There's also a chance of you just getting bored of that piece of gear over time, especially because of the limitations that are tied into any given electronic music piece of gear. It's definitely easy to get bored over time. As a creative person, I find myself always like looking onto the next thing. And this brings us to the next tip, and that is focus on the music and not the gear. Of course, a great example of this is being a DJ, right? So pretty much every venue that you're going to be playing at, apparently they all have the same gear. It's like a Pioneer DJM type of setup. A lot of them travel with a USB stick, plug it in, that's their set. So how do DJs keep it fresh then? From the looks of it, the most exciting part of being a DJ is discovering new music and maybe mixing it with another track in ways that it's never been mixed before. Obviously, the live approach is just a different thing altogether, but maybe taking that little grain of salt from the DJ approach and applying it to a live approach, shifting that focus onto constantly creating new music and the sound of new music as opposed to the gear that you're using. This might prevent some boredom. It might extend the amount of time that you stick to one particular setup without getting bored, or a specific instrument, which ultimately means less money spent on new gear. Also, just like moving slowly, so getting used to a specific setup and then maybe adding, taking away things, essentially just exploring iterations. That's definitely another way to help you save money, but in the end, it's all a journey. We're all in this gear versus instrument spectrum, but we're like a weird species of human. I feel like this niche, we're all like so specific. We like the technical aspect, but we also like creating music, right? It's a really weird and interesting mix. Another important thing is that you have to trust the process. I know that's so cliche to say that. You can't really expect to know the gear that works best for you. Like, it is an investment regardless. Electronic music is an expensive hobby or expensive profession to venture into. This is a time and money investment, especially if you're venturing into hardware. If you're not really into DJing, you might just want to use Ableton Live as your live approach. That's a much more affordable way of doing it. In the end, with these sort of creative things, the answer is always the same. It takes time and an investment to really find out what works best for you. And hopefully this video possibly saves you time or points you into the right direction. Of course, take it all with a grain of salt though. That's a lot of information. So thank you guys. Thanks for being here and see you soon.